This is the first of a series of 10 events that WaterFire has been doing in conjunction with the fact that the NecronomiCon conference is in town for starting tomorrow, for a whole series of events that look at Lovecraft and the historicity of Providence and Lovecraft's interwoven nature with both the fabric of the city and the cultural heritage of the city and the physical infrastructure of the city. Many people don't realize that Lovecraft was a fanatic about the preservation of architectural space. And this, you can arguably make the argument, we've been exploring this with a lot of architectural historians, that the American preservationist architectural movement started with H.P. Lovecraft. There were three cities in particular he was intrigued with: New Orleans, Providence, and Charleston, which are still the preeminent three cities we still think of for remarkable examples of preserved architecture. And I think there's a connection into the literary opinions of Lovecraft. I see Armand in the back there, Barton St. Armand. But let me briefly talk about why WaterFire, why Lovecraft, why we're here, and some of the possibilities of what we're talking about. WaterFire is about creative placemaking, which has a loose meaning, but it's the sense of taking the place we live in, the community we are in now, and weaving it together with ideas and inspiration to make us more excited about where we are and more informed about where we've been and where we're going. And we look as our mission, which is to inspire the city of Providence, in a very broad mandate. And so this, the next 5 days are an example of some of the things that we've been doing. I mentioned Barton St. Armand, who's back there, but one of the first things we did for this weekend was republish a wonderful book that he wrote, which is now available digitally online, about 50 years after it was written, about H.P. Lovecraft, New England Decadent. And Barton makes the point that the connection of Lovecraft as a writer is back to the Romantic poetry movement of the decadence in Europe, and it's astonishing the huge influence that Lovecraft has over Europe. He's far better known in France, Spain, and Italy than he is in the United States. One of the Spanish philosophers listed Lovecraft as one of the top 10 writers of any language in any era, and was not being facetious. So we have put him in this penny dreadful category, but he's a very interesting mind and a curious place. And when we heard that Niels and many others working with the NecronomiCon were bringing the conference back here after 13 years, we thought it was a great opportunity to WaterFire to sort of add whatever ideas and resources we had to work with the many, many people in the community who have been intrigued with Lovecraft and try to make this an anchor city for the Lovecraft convention year after year. And Niels and the NecronomiCon team have loved that idea, but much of the history of what inspired Lovecraft is still here, including this very room. So the idea of coming into this gallery, where Lovecraft came with his aunt, and often disapproved of both the membership and the art, and I'm sure we'll hear about that, but the Art Club and Angel Dean, who's joined us here in being our guest with us, thank you, but the Art Club has put on the walls work by Providence Art Club members of the era when H.P. Lovecraft might have been here. This might have been the artwork he saw on the walls and wrote with varying opinions back around the world. So they went through their archives, which is just a great thank you to Seb and the whole Providence Art Club team, to take this idea of looking at historic creative placemaking in such a real way that they've put back here paintings which were at least painted during the time when we know Lovecraft was in this room. And downstairs there is an exhibition of contemporary artworks responding to Lovecraft. Very quickly, the other things we're doing, which I thought I have a list of here. Tomorrow night we're working with Necronomicon and co-producing the keynote address by S.D. Joshi, which we moved out of the Biltmore Hotel and into the First Baptist Church, another key place for Lovecraft. It's where he went to Sunday school. He lasted a couple of months. He writes very funnily about it. And so the keynote address by the noted scholar S.D. Joshi will be in the First Baptist Church. There's an incident with the organs, so we're doing an organ concert. There are a lot of interesting things coming to that, and that's tomorrow at 5:30. Am I correct? Yes, okay, thanks, Paul. The other thing we're working with, and Paul is a good example, we worked with the John Nicholas Brown Center for the Public Humanities and engaged 4 of their graduate students on the idea of how one might experiment with Lovecraft and history and bringing the humanities into a public space. And they worked on that idea and came up with a project of an augmented reality walking tour, and Paul will be here afterwards for people to talk to. But now with your camera phone, you can look at these iconic buildings that Lovecraft touched, and there'll be all sorts of information, but also considerably other surprises which will erupt in front of your very eyes. Another project we're doing, I'm actually wearing right here, this is the Eye of Providence, which is one of the new WaterFire t-shirts. If you have the right app on your phone, truly startling things will happen to the person you were looking at who is wearing this shirt. So we recommend talking to Paul again about that. Another series of projects is we worked with elementary schools in Providence and had high school students working with Erminio Pinque, and they created, a dozen of them created fantastical models inspired by the Lovecraft stories, and we will be showing them at WaterFire on Saturday. Also, Erminio has joined us along with Necronomicon and some of the conference attendees. We will be summoning Cthulhu in person live Saturday at 11:22 p.m. There's a little debate about the time. It's technically the time when the shadow of the moon reveals the moon to hit the center of the stage, but we may have to adjust the time, but that's our best estimate of when the moon will hit the point on the stage. So that's happening at Waterplace Basin Saturday night, and Forrest Larson, a wonderful contemporary composer who works up at MIT, has composed an original piece of music for that, and we'll have a bunch of other things. We also talked to the owner of the Old Stone Bank and have it open again for the first time in a long, long time. When you do go in and see the plaque that says 1819 there, notice that it actually has tentacle whorls around it. I might have not had enough sleep when I looked at it, but I think you'll see the Jules Vernean element in that woodwork. And so we've invited the steampunk empire of the fork of the Red Branch to come and do an introduction of steampunk. Now, steampunk is another arts movement which I connect to Lovecraft, and both of them have revisionist attitudes about the past and the importance of the past, and sort of a sense of where we are apositionally with the current contemporary time. So we have nearly 60 steampunk performers performing all day Saturday and Sunday from, I don't have it here. It's on our website. Certainly from 2 p.m. to midnight on both Saturday and Sunday. And then we have a huge procession of all these characters who will be going through the middle of WaterFire. So those are some of the ways we think about creative placemaking. What I'd like to now do is switch to the first public program of that, which is my longtime friend, Harry Beckwith, who said he will fulfill his own introduction, and I think truer words could not be said. So thank you in joining me, Harry Beckwith.
Well, you know who I am. But anyway, and Lovecraft used to come here, as you also heard, with his aunt, and to the openings. Well, the openings were free, and if you were living on $15 a week, things like that were very useful. Also, I think they probably had some sort of light refreshment too, which would have made things better. But his aunt, at one point, I knew a woman named Dorothy Casey. And she had been willed by Lucy Truman Aldrich with her art collection, and I believe her sister too, to RISD back when Miss Aldrich died. And Miss Aldrich's sister had married John D. Rockefeller Jr., so one understands. And she met Mrs. Gamwell, and they got on very nicely. But at some point, mention was made of the Casey name. And Mrs. Gamwell said, oh, well, she said, yes. She said, we're descended from Cases, but we don't talk about it. Irish. That's what she said. Dorothy Casey, of course, was happy to laugh at that in the 70s and 80s, whenever it was I talked with her about it. But that's the kind of thing that Lovecraft grew up in. and just to kill the whole thing quickly. He liked Hitler, well, yes, but so didn't Charles Augustus Lindbergh and the Prince of Wales, as he no longer was, but the Duke of Windsor. Many people thought Mr. Hitler was a very fine person, and Germany needed to be put back together again, made to work, and God knows he did it. But he also had other unhappy and unpleasant attitudes. But on the other hand, look at his friends, look at who he married. When it came down to dealing with people, with real people, with friends, it was different. And yes, he had those attitudes, but that wasn't the way he was in real life with his friends and other people. It just wasn't that way. And yes, they're in the letters. All this stuff is in the letters, and the published ones at least, and there it is. But I think he needs to be cut a little slack on it. He was born in 1890, and the house he lived was born in, and I presume he was born at home. I don't think lying in hospital was in business then. Is long gone. I can remember it when it was a doctor's office, and it's right across from the Newport Creamery. And there was still, I think, a coach house behind it. And but then the rest of the block was built up. All that was built up. I didn't know it was Lovecraft's former home then, because I had never heard of Lovecraft. This would have been when I was about 10, I guess, or 12. And but I was told by a friend of my mother's at some point, Catherine Salisbury, who was of the same age, that when she was a little girl, Howard Lovecraft went out and played with matches in the backyard. Well, the backyard consisted of totally undeveloped property, and he lit a fire. And as he explained to her afterwards, imagine having been pretty well trounced for it. Well, I only lit a little fire, said he. That's what she told me. So that was fine. When I was about 15 or 16, I think I discovered Conan Howard. And then that was because I'd gone up to Grant's Hobby Shop, which is where AS 220 is now. And Horace Grant ran this shop. He and his son were there, and John Kilton. They sold coins, stamps, exotic weapons. I still have a Malay Chris I bought there. And his grandson, Donald, was in the basement with books. And he published way back in the 50s, I think something called Rhode Island on Lovecraft, and then he did a bibliography of science fiction and fantasy, 333, and that would have been in the 50s. And it's not a bad piece, but he said, you should read some. I bought these Howard things from him. Gnome Press were the publishers in some strange state out beyond the Hudson. And I bought these things. He said, well, you ought to read H.P. Lovecraft. And I said, why? He said, well, he said, you'd like it. And so finally I read some of H.P. Lovecraft, and I liked it. But that's how Donald started me on the whole thing. And in the end, I met Douglas Dana, who had a bookstore down in Providence. And he, from him, I bought The Outsider for, I think, the total sum of, I think it was maybe $50. And then I got Beyond the Wall of Sleep and all the other in-print Arkham stuff and did all of that. But when Lovecraft died, Douglas Dana had the first pick of what was left. And he went up to the house, and Donald remembered going up with his grandfather after Dana had been through the place, and they got the orts. They got what remained of what was there. And so I knew Donald for years, and then in 74, 73, he said, you know, we really ought to do something here in Providence. There ought to be a convention here in Providence. And so in 75, there was the first World Fantasy Convention. And for that, because Donald said it would be nice, and I might like doing it, I did this tour guide, which I wish I could do over again in a sense, because The information in there isn't bad, but I was my own copy editor, which is never a great idea. And also I was much younger, and it reads like trash. I'm sorry, but as I say, the information is there and it's decent. But Donald Grant was responsible for that convention in a large way. There was a man in New York who put these things on and who was involved in it, and there were one or two others. But there it was. From Douglas Dana, at some point, I bought one of Lovecraft's books. I think it's a copy, Tale of Two Cities. He swept up everything. And for that, I think I paid $10 back in the 70s. But it's got a nice autograph in it, and there it is. Lovecraft talks about these sort of curses. The sins of the fathers shall be inherited by the children under the X generation, however it reads. And his mother, father and mother were first cousins because their mothers were sisters. And all these people lived out in the western part of the state. And Jeremiah Phillips, who was Lovecraft's great-grandfather, great-grandfather's mother dies in 1848. The next thing that hits him is his wife dies, and then before the year turns, he falls into the machinery sort of by accident of his mill, and he just sort of goes through his 100 yards of gingham or something. I don't know what they ran through there, but he's a horrible death. And there are these people dying. Well, then in 1849, his brother-in-law, who's married to his wife's sister, also clocks in. And all that's left is this one great-grandparent, this man's widow, who lives until 1868, and she brings up Whipple Van Buren Phillips and Rovey Place, his first cousin, her daughter, and they marry and produce Sarah Susan Phillips, who then marries Winfield Scott Lovecraft and produces Howard Phillips Lovecraft. But can you imagine what this was like in a Victorian home? How this kind of thing came rattling down the rails. Fortunately, Whipple Van Buren Lovecraft was economically fairly savvy, and he made money. Witness this house he lived in, a nice big Victorian house on the corner of Elm Grove and Angel. But he died in 1904, and of course his widow, who was still alive, his wife had already died. But he dies in 1904, leaving the two daughters, and there's nobody around to make any money, because you see, in the old days, women didn't have that opportunity. They did not go to college. I had a friend, a connection of Lovecraft's, who told me that her father refused to send her to college. Her brothers went to college, but she couldn't go. And he said, "But I will buy you any book you want." So she took her cousin Ann Brown's advice, and she started buying Fest books at a very high expense from exquisitely expensive dealers in New York. And the old man, I think, financially was far worse off than if he'd sent her to college. And she'd have done well if she'd had it, too. But never mind. That was the way it was. Nobody was going to be making any money. He had invested in some fairly speculative things. There was something out in the far west to do with, I think, damming rivers, Snake River, maybe something like that. All of this went down the tubes. And as a result, the house had to be sold, and Lovecraft's world became smaller and smaller and smaller. And yes, he was here, but he had no money. And as I say at the end, it was $15 a week. The family owned some shares in a coal mine, if you can believe it, that was out in a place called Garden City, south of Cranston. And there's now a shopping mall, but every once in a while some of the mall disappears into the ground because the coal mine is still subsiding. And the stuff they were producing was practically slate, from what I understand it. I can remember the thing as a kid being driven past there, and then we went by Sakanasset, a fine old Indian name for what they decided the boys' training school should be named. And it would always be pointed out to me by my father as where I'd end up if I didn't shape up. And but there it was, and but there was no money. My father was a year behind Lovecraft at Hope High School. He knew him. Well, the whole East Side knew each other. In my time, I didn't realize until I was in middle age that I'd basically grown up in a Yankee ghetto, and that all my childhood friends were, in fact, and some of them recognizably so because they were within the degrees you recognize, like, say, a third cousin, of being my relatives. And Lovecraft, and as I say, my grandparents were born in the 1850s and whatnot, and so my background, the family I grew up in was not that different in a way from Lovecraft's in terms of their values. My father, for instance, whenever the name Roosevelt was mentioned in the house, one had to first ascertain which century you were in. Teddy had ruined American business. Franklin was worse than he was, and his children were not an ornament to their generation by any consideration. But you had to figure out who you were talking about. It was that kind of thing. And so he grew up in this kind of thing. Oh, and also remember, he comes home with his wife, who is a woman who's made her way in the world and made a name for herself doing it. And what does his aunt say? Oh no, Howard's wife couldn't possibly work in Providence, hold a job. It wouldn't do. That's what was said. So there were some real problems there, and I think Providence isn't Boston, but Providence certainly is Boston in miniature. And if you stop and think about how these things were, it was a fairly circumscribed upbringing that he had. Now, the old shunned house I lived next door to for a year. I rented an apartment in the building next to it. And I knew the Bullocks. Old Mr. Bullock with a beard came down about to here, and he looked like he'd taken snuff all his life. He was covered with this brown stuff, which I finally discovered later on must have been because the house was so filthy. But he used to sit on the front steps, and Mrs. Bullock would be seen around and about, and they both went to St. John's Cathedral. And he finally died. Well, nobody knew about it for a while. When they finally got into the house, he'd been laid out in the bed for about a week, I think, and she was cooking TV dinners. They'd been cooking TV dinners in the fireplace. But she survived, and some years later I ran into her. She had wandered up to Congdon Street, and she didn't know where she was. And so I said hello to her, and would she like me to walk her home? Well, yes, she would, and who was I? After all, you don't accept an arm from a strange man. And I told her who I was, and then, during our walk down the hill and down Benefit Street, I had the interesting sensation of being my own grandfather, because she was inquiring about my grandmother and about people who were long dead. I knew the names. And I knew their grandchildren, but they were dead. And it was amazing. But also, this woman, well, there were women in Providence who had clothes. They didn't buy clothes, they had them. Old Miss Dwight was one of these. She inherited the Carrington house and the Dwight house and a big India trade fortune to go with it. But the safety pin and Scotch tape were her best friends. Even when she went out to Butler. Now, Butler is where Lovecraft's parents died. Many of these people, including cousins of my own, my cousin Bessie Henshaw, among others, were out there, and they were there because it was perfectly comfortable, and they weren't crazy, but the Minden, which had been set up by the Harrisoffs, named for the place they came from in Germany, they couldn't live there any longer. They needed what you'd now call assisted living. So they were out in the Butler Hospital for the Insane, those bereft by God's providence of their reason, as I believe the plaque read inside the door, which must have cheered up anyone admitted there. And they carried all their old duels out with them. Cousin Bessie and she would fight over, they'd steal each other's slippers, and there were other arguments about various things in Providence, because the old games were still going on. It was just in a smaller circle of people. But at any rate, Miss Dwight lived down in Skip Moran's house now. It's further on down. There was the Dwight house, Dwight home, and she. Well, it's not money, so we're not going to look for it. But at any rate, there were the Bullocks, and I met them, and the house was bought after a while by people who were indirectly related to me, and it's all fixed up now, and it looks beautiful. But I wouldn't want to own it, because I'll bet you every Halloween they have to have somebody out in front to keep the faithful from cutting pieces off it to take home to make icons out of it. And but old Miss Dwight, here's another Providence operation. She had this huge house, but she also owned 3 triple-deckers across the street on what is the last cobblestone street in Providence. And she rented these out at practically zero rent to various poor families who she felt needed homes. And then the winter would come, and she would slip over to a spare bedroom in a building she was paying the heat for and let the Dwight house get cold, and that was that. When she died, Skip Moran found several containers of ashes. One of them, he knew the man's trust officer, so he took it down to Hospital Trust and dropped it on his desk and said, "Here, it's yours." And there was one other who he didn't know, and he just, well, the storm sewer system of Providence is copious. So that's where that went. That cobblestone street, it's an extension of Bowen Street, is interesting because BBC came over here in 1995. There was a horror thing that was being put on, and it was many segments, called the A to Z of horror. And in the segment C for chaos, they decided to come to Providence. And of course, they needed to hire some native who wouldn't rob them blind to sort of act as a guide and drag them into the whole thing. And so I was taken on the strength of the thing. And we did a bit in there. And of course, we had to get Mr. Lovecraft in. Well, there were 2 dead ringers in Providence, Stuart Sherman, who was a librarian at the Providence Public Library, and Nino Scotti, one of my old friends. And Stuart had unfortunately preceded Nino and I to Swan Point, so he was no longer available, but they were both absolute dead ringers. And Nino played Lovecraft in this thing. He was a man of considerable dignity who was an auctioneer and appraiser, and very interested in the China trade, but he did it, and he's in there. But we did part of it in that street. Well, young Frank Moran was home having supper with his parents, and he came out to discover various monsters in costume roaming around in the street, arc lights glaring, and all hell breaking loose. So, and then I explained to Frank what was going on. So I said, "Why don't you go get Skip?" So he got his father. He was amazed. Even more amazed than the day I told him he was related to Lovecraft. This is something that the East Side has taken with sort of a little unease. They're interested, but people have memories, and they're not that interested. They're a little nervous about it. You never know. So there it is, but none of these are close relationships. All of them are way out. Now, Ken Fay, who I met years and years ago, has done a wonderful amount of work on Lovecraft's Ancestry. And he has disproved most of what Lovecraft was told. And the one thing I never can understand in that whole business is Lovecraft's great aunt had these charts done. Well, how you could tell, how she had to have gotten the information from Lovecraft's great-grandfather, and how the man could have falsified his own parents and turned them from a simple merchant seaman into gentry, and how his wife could have not only done that, but changed her name and become a member of a fairly important Devonshire family. Fortunately, her claimed father had noted in his will that he died a bachelor, and furthermore, he was a clerk in holy orders, and so he wouldn't have gotten married. So that's so, and furthermore, he died 10 years before she was born, so that pretty much took care of that attribution. And after that, Ken went after it hammer and tongs and was able to figure the whole thing out. But how can you imagine someone telling their children total fantasy falsehood about their even immediate ancestry? I mean, how could you do that to someone? Well, anyway, it was done, and that's what it was. But Ken has got it all sorted out, and it's published, and it's fine. The other thing he did that was truly wonderful was Lovecraft is descended from Anne Hutchinson. Anne Hutchinson was a fairly independent woman who got into a great deal of trouble up in Boston, and who ended up down in New York State, where she was murdered by a band of Indians, she and most of her children, but not all. And a parkway was named after her, the Hutchinson Memorial Parkway. And those of us who knew in Rhode Island, if we didn't have a close connection with the late Senator Pell, could get instant service when we called up and say something, and they'd say, "Well, you are," and I would say, "Yeah." Well, I said, "I'm Harry Beckwith, and one of his ancestors murdered one of my aunts way back," and this would stop them dead. Same thing with Lick Chafee. His staff had never heard of the fact that through the Brushes, his mother's family, he's descended from Pocahontas. I asked blithely at one point if he was ever going to play the Indian card when he was running for Senate. They didn't know what I was asking, but there it was. So that's about, well, I met a lot of my father's friends, and they remembered Lovecraft. The general opinion was he was bright. He was very bright, but he was very odd, and furthermore, he was not athletic. And anyone male in this room knows what that means when you're, say, between 12 and 18 in school. It's a burden to carry. And but he was remembered, and at the Athenaeum they remembered him. Catherine Burlingame knew him. Everybody sort of knew him. I think he would be absolutely amazed that anybody knows anything about him now. And the fact that this thing is happening now in Providence, and that thing happened back in '75, I'd be absolutely amazed. The man died when he was young because he had a foul diet. He lived on ice cream and coffee and sugar, and among other things, and it was awful. And he died young. But he could have lived, born in 1890, let's see, by 1980, well, let's say he could live till 1970 with ease. He'd have been a rich man. He'd at least been comfortably off. And yet he died on $15 a week. And admittedly, he died in the Jane Brown Hospital, and that's where you went in the old days if you were the right sort. But still, it must have been a terrible life. And the one thing that held him back in Providence was, of course, there was no money. Well, things have changed now, and I'm willing to bet that a large number of the women in this room had a decent education and think rather better of themselves than their grandmothers did. So if anybody would like to ask me any questions, I'm happy to try and answer them. And basically what I have done is, I haven't done anything with Lovecraft for years. But I've always been interested in the Providence stories because I was here. I walked around those places. I knew them. I knew stories about the people who owned them. I also later on came to like the Dunsanian things like The Strange High House and the Mist and The Terrible Old Man much better than I did on my first reading when I was, say, 20, 25. But it's the person I've been interested in. And partly, as I say, because he comes out of the same kind of background, ethnically and whatnot, that I have, and in the same place, even though a slightly different time. But yet there's enough of a carryover. So if there's anything I might be able to tell you, I'd like to try to, but I don't know what I, yes.
One thing I'm kind of interested, you wrote lots of letters, and he said you wrote lots of letters, and you ever said meet with anyone, when you ever speak with anyone, spend time in conversation with him, spend time in conversation with him, you got together, what was it like you say, you go out and drink, or
Oh, well, no, I did. There was a man, Fritz Leiber, came up for the 75 thing. There was a little trouble over the hotel bill afterwards, and his wife had to leave him as security while she went back to New York to collect the necessary funds. But he knew him well, and he said he was wonderful, you know. And I think I read somewhere he managed to get himself lit one night, and he absolutely spouted information. But I gather he was, and I met the Eddies, Clifford Eddy and his wife, and they found him very congenial and very talkative and very interesting person. Is that what you're? Yeah. So I think everybody found him very congenial. I think the attitudes he had, to drop back to them, were common attitudes. They were very common attitudes, and he had them. But I think what has to also be said, and I said it before, in his real life, he didn't treat people that way. He didn't treat his friends that way. So, yes.
You were mentioning about Lovecraft's attitudes towards Hitler. Don't forget that when his downstairs neighbor was a German teacher, went over to Germany to be part of the German rebirth. And when she saw what was happening over there, vis-a-vis the persecution of Jews, and came back and told him that, he never said anything good about Hitler again after that, except he understood what he should. And he was only saying that in order to get Vernon kicked off.
Okay. Well, as I said before, I have not kept up on Lovecraft for years. He's a distant cousin, and that's it. But that is interesting information to have.
As soon as he found out what the real deal was,
He may not, never said anything good about the guy after that.
never said anything.
Never
good
quite
about the
came
guy
around
after.
and started attacking.
Never quite came around and started attacking
in World War II. I believe that he
In World War II, I think that he probably
would not have been happy.
would not have been a happy camper.
And one
Oh,
thing
I think you're right.
And one thing that I realized that is that never
Lovecraft's mother
realized
died. That was the
Lovecraft's
first.
mother died.
Oh,
That was the first.
thing that said it.
That was the first.
But it
thing
really
that
sounded
said
to see
read.
if,
But it really sounded as if there were
kicked
two
off
of
as
as well.
well.
Both of his aunts as well. Both of his aunts.
Keep on with that. It would have been really.
Well-
They weren't around to tell
Good.
Sonia.
They
We're
weren't
sorry,
around to
dear.
tell
We just can't
Sonia.
have Howard.
We're sorry, dear. We just can't have
train
Howard
in
spotlight
Providence.
and train in Providence.
Yeah. Well, my great-great-grandfather, one of them, had a number of children, and I have several portraits taken of the young children before they kicked off and were put in the burial ground. And one is not terribly sorry about these things because it means there are fewer to inherit. And in this case, he would have had probably $45 a month, a week, to live on.
Andy Cantwell died quite well.
Yeah, but he would have had more money. And
He had like around over $10,000. That's $19,000.
yes, yes.
That would have kept him in coffee and ice cream for a good many years.
Well, they would probably have killed him. But you see, this is what I was hoping would come from this, is that I have not kept, I don't know, I'm not someone who's particularly into literary criticism. I'm not someone who's spent a lot of time studying a lot of these things, but some of the things that I said would prompt people to ask me questions. And thank you. Annette, anyone else? I don't bite. Yes.
Harry, thanks for a fantastic talk. Harry, on the business for fantastic Providence. So the theme is I am Providence. So the theme is so we have an idea of what Providence means. So we have an idea of what Providence. So I can understand what does Providence mean. So I can understand what does Providence mean to you.
Angel Street and Waterman Street and all the other streets in this city had towering elms over them. You'd walk down that street as a child, and there were these trees 4 and 5 feet in diameter, and they arched up, and they met over the top of the street, and you walked down this aisle of shade and coolness. That's Providence. That's Providence. But yes, you're born, I forget who it was, I think it was some Romanian or certainly Eastern European who said, and this was many, many years ago, a man is born in one place and at one time. That's it. Wherever you were born, wherever you grew up, that's home. In a funny kind of way, even if you're not there any longer, that's home. And thank you. One final thing. Ken Fagg discovered that Lovecraft was descended from Chad Brown, who was the rector of the First Baptist Meeting House after Roger Williams. And of course, from Chad Brown comes John Nicholas Brown and Carter Brown of the National Gallery and all of that. And also Moses Brown and the Four Brothers and 50 South Main Street, and Howard Lovecraft would have been absolutely pleased over that. And I was able to tell a cousin of mine here tonight that he very definitely was descended, was a relative of Lovecraft through that, as we were both related through the thing too. So it's, as I say, it's a very small town, depending on how big you want to make it. Well, I'm glad I could do this because the only thing I cared about was that it would be tape recorded. Because these things that I had to say tonight are very inconsequential. They're personal reminiscences. But I had them, and I don't want to sit down and write a book about them. But I had them. And I thought it would be nice if they were recorded so that people could look at them or listen to them later on, and maybe they'd be interested. I didn't know, but at least it would be off my conscience. So there it is, and thank you very, very much, and I'm going to have a drink.
I want to thank Harry, who I've known for a long time, and every time we have a conversation, whole new universes open up that you don't even realize might have been yawning in the near future in front of you.
Barnaby is fascinating. This never became apparent until many years after we'd met, and then it all suddenly blossomed.
I suddenly discovered this, I think through you, that I had all these cousins. I came here from the West Coast and discovered I had all sorts of cousins here. I had one little quote I was going to find here if I can do it. But I want to thank the Art Club for joining us in this adventure. I know Seb is here, Angel Dean's here. Thank you so much hosting this. I'll find this one little thing I wanted to end up here. Because I think in Lovecraft's writings, you often find he really often has himself. So in the Call of Cthulhu, which we're using as the source piece for some of the things we're doing, and which Paul used as a source piece for the graduate students over at John Nicholas Brown, again, another connection there, there's this description of Wilcox, and I would love you to see it. I think we're talking about the same man. Yeah, from the Fleur-de-Lis building, exactly. So Wilcox is described, Wilcox was a precocious youth of known genius, but great eccentricity, and had from childhood excited attention through the strange stories and odd dreams he was in the habit of relating. He called himself psychically hypersensitive, but the staid folks of the ancient commercial city dismissed him as merely queer, in quotes. Never mingling much with his kind, he had dropped gradually from social visibility and was now known only to a small group of aesthetes from other towns.
It's autobiographical.
It certainly sounds autobiographical. And then the T-shirt we were going to make is the next line, which is, even the Providence Art Club, anxious to preserve its conservatism, had found him quite hopeless. So the bar is open, and thank you for joining us.